So we are in the midst of a conversation that relates to the question of who is more compelling. Somebody who confesses to, and we're talking, by the way, just to be clear, about financial, not criminal matters. So in a financial situation, who's more compelling? A person who confesses that they owe money, or a witness, single witness, who testifies that they owe money? Because there's no question about it, two witnesses are always the most powerful, most compelling argument that you can get. The Torah is very clear that two witnesses establish facts. Our question is one witness who's testifying versus a person who's confessing. And again, I'm not saying that this is the same case. I'm not saying this guy's confessing and the witness is testifying against him. We're just comparing empirically. What's the difference between a person who confesses that they owe money versus somebody who testifies alone as an individual that the person owes money? Okay, why are we having this conversation? That's the real question. Why are we having this conversation? Well, it turns out that our Gemorah believes that the key to answering that question of which is the more compelling argument, who has more legitimacy, the Gemorah is going to suggest that all of that information can be gleaned from our Mishnah, even though it's a completely different topic, it's unrelated, but we're going to see that the topics might be unrelated, but the principles could be related. For anybody who's just walked through the door, you are now wondering, what on earth are we talking about? So here's the backstory. The backstory is we started, like every Gemorah, with a Mishnah. The Mishnah that our Gemorah began with, and at this point we're only focused on the first part of that Mishnah. But there's still more stuff to come. Remember, there was a guy riding the animal, all that. We haven't touched that. So the first story of the Mishnah is this. Two people walk in to a Beis Din, into a Jewish court. And they're both clinging for dear life to what the Mishnah calls a tallis, which is not a ritual garment, it's just a garment. Okay, so picture the scene. Two guys, they're holding onto this garment. Why are they in court? Well, that's because the one person says, this garment belongs entirely to me. And the other guy says, this garment belongs entirely to me. There are no witnesses. So this is literally this person's word against that person's word. So the Mishnah, before we get to the Gemorah, the Mishnah says, so what do we do? The Mishnah says, the first person has to take an oath in front of the court, in front of the judges, and that oath has to be, I deserve no less than half of this garment. Then the other guy has to say, I swear that I deserve no less than half of this garment. Once they've done that, the court will take the garment, sell it, and split the profits between the two guys. That's the Mishnah's case. Now let's get to where we are now. We've just come across a case with a person called Rabbi Chia. However, before we can get into Rabbi Chia's case, remember, there was background to Rabbi Chia's case. And by the time we start this conversation, we have at least two pieces of background information before we get the third piece of information, which is in the Gemorah itself. So what's the second piece of background information? There's a guy, he appears in all of our Gemorahs. His name is Ruvain. And he has a friend who appears in all of our Gemorahs. His name is Shimon. Right? Wherever you go, there's the Ruvain and Shimon cases. So Ruvain comes to Shimon and he says, you owe me a moneh. What's a moneh? Anybody remember how many zuz is a moneh? 100 zuz. Ruvain comes to Shimon, you owe me 100 zuz. Now that could be because I lent you money. Could be because I sold you a product and you have to pay me. It could be because I performed a service for you and this is my bill. It could be because I asked you to look after my 100 zuz and now I need it back. Doesn't matter how it came to be. The argument is, you have 100 zuz of mine. Shimon says, I don't know what you're talking about. I only have 50 zuz of yours. So, if he had said, I owe you nothing, we'd say, okay, that's the end of the case. It's his word against his word. There are no witnesses, that's it. But he didn't say, I owe nothing. He said, I owe 50% of your claim. That makes us wonder, hang on a second, is he telling the truth? Because sounds like maybe he's actually acknowledging that he owes some money over here. So the 50 zuz that he agrees that he owes, obviously has to pay. There's no question about that. But the Torah then says there's now another 50 zuz that Ruvain is claiming from him that he's denying. Because he acknowledged part of the money claimed from him, the Torah now expects him to take an oath that he doesn't owe anything further. And an oath is a very serious business. So if he's willing to take that oath, then we'll say, okay, fine. He obviously doesn't owe the money. Okay, that's the case. The backstory to this case. Rabbi Chia comes along. Rabbi Chia says, what happens if Reuven comes to Shimon and he says, you owe me 100 zuz? Shimon says, nonsense, I owe you nothing. Then Levi appears. And Levi's got a friend called Yehuda. And Levi and Yehuda come along and they say, we know for a fact, we can testify. Now there are two witnesses, so that's very compelling. We can testify that you owe 50 zuz. What happens now? Does he pay 50 zuz? Of course he does. They're witnesses. Does he have to take an oath? That's the big question over here. Does he now have to take an oath for the balance? Rabbi Chia says he must. Of course he must. Because if you don't make him take an oath, then you're effectively saying that his confession is more powerful than witnesses. Because look, in the case of his confession, he pays the amount he confesses to, and he has to take an oath for the balance. And if you tell me that in the case of witnesses who testify that he owes 50 zuz, he only has to pay, and he doesn't take an oath, you're telling me that witnesses have less impact, are less compelling than the man's own confession. That does not make sense. And Rabbi Chia says this is what we call a kal v'chomer. What's a kal v'chomer? You know what a kal v'chomer is? Kal v'chomer? So a kal v'chomer is? A kal v'chomer is? How much? It's a how much more so. You got to speak like you're in yeshiva, you know? It's a how much more so. What does it mean? A how much more so? So it means it's a logical process that basically says this. If the truth of a lesser case is X, then it definitely must be the truth of a greater case. So let's use the example that we keep using again and again and again. And that is the example of, if the scrawniest guy in the shul could do Hagbah on that Torah, then so-and-so the bodybuilder, Kal Vachomer, he certainly could do Hagbah on that Torah. Okay? That's what Rabbi Chia is saying over here. If my own confession is strong enough to make me have to take an oath about the part that I'm not confessing to, how much more so witnesses who are always more powerful? Surely if they testify about 50% of the claim, he would have to take an oath on the balance. And we think our Mishnah is proof of that. Why do we think our Mishnah is proof of that? So this is where it gets really interesting. He says, freeze frame. Okay, just imagine for a moment, you're a judge sitting in the court, alongside your other two judges, because there's a minimum of 3 judges, right? You're sitting in the court, freeze frame, there's 2 guys holding onto this tallis, holding onto this garment. From your vantage point on the bench, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? I'll tell you what you're seeing, says Rabbi Chia. You're seeing one guy who says, you've got part of my garment in your hands. Just like this guy said, you've got my 100 zuz in your hands. Same concept. So you got part of my garment in your hands, because actually the whole garment belongs to me. The other guy says, nonsense. None of the garment belongs to you, which is pretty much like Shimon saying, hey, I owe you no money. Same logic. So each one of them is effectively saying, I deserve everything that's being claimed. Who are the witnesses in this case? The judge is sitting on the bench because they're watching the story. From what they can see, what does it look like? Again, freeze frame. What does it look like right now? If you have a picture of 2 people holding a garment, pulling it, what does it look like? Looks like they're 50-50 partners in this garment. So we technically have witnesses that say 50% belongs to him, 50% belongs to him. Like in our case, right? Where Reuven says, you owe me 100 zuz. Shimon says, I owe you 0. It's exactly like the 2 guys for the tallis. The whole tallis is mine. The whole tallis is mine. And then you have witnesses who come to say 50% is his. You know, it's 50% he owes, 50% he doesn't owe. And what does our Mishnah say you do with these 2 people in this case, with the tallis? You make them take an oath. Aha! You see? If there are witnesses to 50 or to a partial claim, when the 2 litigants have absolute claims, because he says absolutely everything is mine, he says absolutely everything is mine, well, the witnesses invoke an oath. See, it proves my point, says Rabbi Chia. That was the easier part of this Gemorah. Now we are already on page 35. The point of the Gemorah at this stage is to say, whoa, hang on a second. You, Rabbi Chia, just used the expression kal v'chomer. What did you mean when you said kal v'chomer? In other words, kal v'chomer means that it's clear that one case is a lenient or lesser case, and one case is a stricter or more difficult case. What did you mean when you said kal v'chomer? Please just spell it out for us. Explain why you think that the witnesses are a stronger, more compelling case than confession. That's basically where the Gemorah is going to go right now. So, at the top of page 35, let's do, first of all, our vocabulary for this piece. So we've got an expression over here which is Rami ... al. Do you see that? We've actually had this expression before, but it's been a while, so it's worth revisiting it. Rami ... al. I'll be impressed if anybody remembers what it is. Rami al. Correct. Very good. Right? Rami al means impose upon. So it's actually a legal term. And it actually refers to when the courts impose an oath onto a person. Okay? So here's a person who, for whatever reason, is caught up in some kind of a legal dispute. If the sages impose an oath on the person, we'll say, Rami alav shavua. Okay, that's the expression we'll use. Another word that we've had already before, rachamona. Correct. So just remember that whenever you have a noun in Aramaic that has an aleph at the end of it, if it was in Hebrew, that aleph would have been a hey at the beginning. So, rachamona in Hebrew would be ha-rachamon. Now that sounds more familiar, right? Ha-rachamon, which means the merciful one, which effectively refers to Hashem. And whenever the Gemorah wants to quote the Torah, it will say rachamona. The Torah says such and such. In other words, Hashem said such and such in his Torah. Okay? Next term we haven't yet encountered. I don't believe we've encountered. Perhaps we have. It's just a prefix. Ki de. And then there obviously have to be a word, and the word that follows it is almost always a name. Right? Sometimes it could be ki de omar, the name. Okay? So what is ki de? Okay, so let's work it out. The prefix ke is like. Okay, ke, the prefix is like. De, the prefix de, has various forms of what it could mean. One of them is that. So ke de, like that. And basically what this does is it introduces to us an opinion where whatever the Gemorah is saying would make sense according to that opinion. So we say, this thing that we've just said is ki de, is like so-and-so's opinion. Or ki de omar so-and-so, this is like so-and-so said. So it's introducing basically that there's going to be an opinion that supports what we've just learned. Next phrase, azus ponim. This is a term we haven't yet learned. Azus ponim.
Ponim will be face.
Good. So ponim is a face. What is azus ponim? If you don't know it, you don't know. Not face value. No what?
Not face value.
Not face value. Azus ponim. It's funny because we're going to translate it without using an English word. Azus ponim is chutzpah. Okay, azus ponim. Now you might be wondering at this point, what does chutzpah have to do with our Gemorah? Okay, we'll see. Azus, strong. It's like a strong face. In other words, the person who's they don't have the humility or the shame not to put on their strong face when they're doing something inappropriate. So that's chutzpah. Okay, azus ponim.
They don't put on the strong face.
Yeah. No, they do. I'm saying,
So
sorry,
it's
they
like
do.
what
They
we
don't.
call a bold.
Yeah, they're bold. Right, bold-faced lie, right? The same kind of concept, right? Azus ponim. They put on their strong face. Okay, next word. Ba'al choiv. Okay, Ba'al choiv. It's a nice way to unpack a term. It's not a word. It's actually a title, but it's quite nice once you unpack it. So what's Baal is a master, right? Baal is a master, or another word instead of the master?
Head.
No. What happens if I say Balabayas?
Head.
It's not really the head. I mean, we translate it as the head of the home, but it's not really what it means.
Leader.
The owner of the home. So Baal choiv is the owner of the, what's a choiv? You shouldn't know of such things. You know, people say, oi, do I have choivus? Ever heard that expression? I have choivus. What's a choiv? A debt. Choivus are debts. So what's the Baal choiv?
Lender.
Who's the owner of the debt?
Lender.
The creditor, right? The creditor is the owner of the debt. Okay. So Baal choiv is the creditor. Okay. We also have a very important halakhic principle that we have to learn before we can start this Gemorah, and that is the principle called a chazaka. Now, everybody knows what a chazaka is without anybody knowing what a chazaka is. Because people use the term all the times, particularly in the frum community. Everyone's like, he has a chazaka, I have a chazaka, do you have a chazaka? But nobody really knows what it means. Usually what people imply when they say chazaka is almost like I have the right to something. That's usually what they imply. So, for example, when it comes to one of the special aliyahs that people get on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's when people start invoking their chazaka. I have a chazaka. I always get maftir yoina. Right? What's a chazaka? It's not that I have the rights to it. That's not what it means. Chazaka comes from the word chazak, which obviously means strong. Now, if you have a claim on something, you could have a weak claim or you could have a strong claim. So the implication of chazaka is that you have a strong claim in whatever it is that you're saying. How do you get to have a strong claim? By virtue of a chazaka. Chazaka means, as you'll see over here, a legal presumption. Let's use a few examples. And you'll see that not every example is in the same legal realm, but it's just interesting. Okay, so number one. And we had this conversation right at the beginning of the Gemorah, actually. Right at the beginning of the Gemorah. So I say, Ryan, that's not your watch. You thought I was going to say pen, right? But then I realized it might not be your pen, so that's why I changed to watch. Okay, so I said it's not your watch. What's your defense?
I've had it for many years. It is my watch.
That's not your defense. Your defense is it's on your arm.
Okay.
So therefore, possession is 9/10 of the law. So you have a chazaka. There's a legal presumption that it's your watch. And the onus is on me to prove otherwise. If I have a claim, I have to prove otherwise. Because you have a chazaka, it is presumed that possession is 9/10 of the law. And if you've got something, it's probably yours. That's chazaka. One instance of chazaka. Next instance. That's movable, right? A movable item, possession is 9/10 of the law. What about fixed property? How does a person establish the chazaka, the legal presumption that something is theirs, if it's fixed property? Right? You might not be anywhere near the place. So how do you know it's yours? How do you illustrate that it's yours? Let's say you're not there. You'll have a document, right? Let's say in the absence of a document, because documents are too easy. Because a document is not a chazaka, a document is a document. That's something which is much more legally binding. But in the absence of a document, how do you know it's my house? When somebody knocks on the door to do a survey and they say, are you the homeowner? How do they know that you're the homeowner? Maybe you're just a mischievous guest who decided you're going to give the survey response on behalf of the people, right? So how do you know that you're the homeowner? What's the chazaka for a property? Keys. If I have the keys, the presumption is it's probably my place.
What about a tenant?
What about?
A tenant.
A tenant is the legal occupant of that place. Therefore, he has the keys. Okay?
So not the owner. The occupant.
Correct. Well, he owns the lease of this property. So technically, he is the owner for that period, whether it's the owner of the actual unit, okay, fine. But he owns the access order. There's another way.
The right to be there.
Correct. So, exactly. Here, there's another way which is really fascinating, and that is that if you occupy a property for 3 years without anybody contesting your rights to that property, the chazaka is that it's yours. We just presume that if you were a squatter, somebody would have said something within 3 years. Very interesting halacha. Again, I don't want to go down all the halachic implications, just illustrating the point. Okay, here's another one. A woman arrives in town, nobody's ever met her before, and she's looking for a shidduch. We have a chazaka that she's probably single. We're not going to assume that she ran away from her husband. That's an statistically unlikely case. You don't have a thing, where a person comes along and they say, listen, I'm looking for a shidduch. You say, whoa, I don't know who you are. Yeah, chazaka. You just presume that the average. Whereas, if a couple went on an overseas trip, and she comes back and says, you won't believe, poor thing, my husband fell off the 4th floor balcony and he's no longer with us. I'd like to get remarried. We say, whoa, hang on a second. When last we knew of you, you had a chazaka that you were married. We can't just undo that based on your hearsay. He fell off the balcony. Well, bring some evidence, right? So you can see how it plays in many different areas of law is the concept of chazaka. We're going to deal with a different kind of chazaka in this case. And it's quite similar to something we touched on in the Mishnah, the original Mishnah. This is a psychological chazaka. In other words, this is not a legal chazaka where you've actually got some kind of legal basis for what you're saying. This is where the law will go a certain way because we have a chazaka that we expect that people's psychology is typically the same. So what's human psychology? Human psychology that we're going to deal with over here is chazaka. We assume, and that assumption has legal basis, or at least has legal impact. We assume that people will not disrespect their benefactors. That's what we assume. Are there meshugoyim out there? Yes, there are. Are there people who bite the hand that feeds them? Yes, there are. But we presume that the average person is not that person. Much like right at the beginning of our Mishnah, remember we said, maybe this guy's trying to steal the garment away from the other person. We said chazaka. On average, the average person is not a thief. The average person can have a blind spot, they can see things their way and therefore believe that they're entitled to something they're not truly entitled to. But the average person is not a thief. Likewise, the average person is not going to have azus panim, it's not going to have chutzpah in front of their benefactor. So, not in their benefactor, he's actually going to use the word bal choiv because it's not only a benefactor. It's any time that you owe a person money. We assume people are very embarrassed in front of somebody they owe money to, and they're not going to have the chutzpah to say to the person directly, I owe you nothing. Therefore, if a person does say, I owe you nothing, we actually take that seriously. Because that's quite a statement to make. By the way, I'll give you another illustration of a similar thing. If a woman appears in front of the courts and says, my husband divorced me, we're going to say, listen, maybe, we're not so sure. Sounds to me like you want out of this marriage and But if a woman comes to court with her husband and says, he divorced me, we're going to say, he probably did. Because you would never say that in front of him. It's the easiest thing for him to dispel, to dispute your claim. So you would never say it in front of him unless you really believed it. So it's the same kind of psychology over here. We say, if somebody says, you owe me money, the average person is not going to look him directly in the eye and say, no, I don't, unless they actually don't. That's an important part of how Rabbi Chia is going to build his case. I experimented with something a little different on the sheet, as you will notice, which is to color code the key words that represent the question and the answer, etc. You see that? So, my, which is the first word we've got over here, is a key word that illustrates the beginning of a shaila. What's a shaila?
Question.
Correct. What kind of a question?
Rhetorical.
Not rhetorical.
Question.
A genuine question, seeking information, seeking an answer, right? So shaila is an investigative question, it's a research question, it's a question that really would like information. So the Gemorah asks this question, what, in other words, please define for me, you Rabbi Chia, please define for me what you meant when you said, Shaloi tehei hoido aspiv. Okay, these are words we've already done, so let's see if anybody can reconstruct them. Shaloi tehei hoido aspiv.
just giving you guys a chance. We're going to keep quiet. So please, guys.
That's exactly what I was doing.
You know, to be rude for us as a chazaka that you guys
I don't want to be as Ospanim. I'm just going to chill.
Oh.
You can stay.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
You're fitting perfectly.
Okay, shaloi tehei hoidoas piv.
We don't want
That his verbal confession, correct, that we don't want to have, or that his verbal confession should not be, right? Sheloi tehei hoidoas piv. That his verbal confession should not be. Right, so his verbal confession should not be gedoila, greater, me hadoas edim, than the testimony of witnesses. Okay, so we don't want, you Rabbi Chia said, we don't want to have the confession of a person's, so to speak, mouth, in other words, his own confession, to be greater than the testimony of witnesses. And the reason we didn't want that to happen was mi kal v'chomer, because of the logic of a kal v'chomer. And that's why this part is underlined, because that's the key of what the question is. The question is not what do you mean that you don't want his confession to be more powerful than witnesses. You're saying what is the kal v'chomer behind that? We want to understand that kal v'chomer. What is that kal v'chomer? So says the Gemorah on Rabbi Chia's behalf, let me explain. What I'm saying is, Shaloi toimar. So this is in green because this is the beginning of the answer. Shaloi toimar. What I'm saying is, Shaloi toimar. Anybody?
Verbal confession.
Share that. What? No, say.
I was going to say like when he said something.
Sheloi.
When he didn't say something.
So Sheloi Tamar, that he should not say, or we should not say, or you. Tamar is actually you in the singular. Sheloi Tamar. I don't want you to say, this is Rabbi Chia's thought process. I don't want you to say, Hoido as piv. His confession, right? Hoido as piv. His confession. Who? That is the scenario. De Ramyo Rachmono Shavua Alei. Okay, what's Rami Alei? Impose upon, right? What's Rachmona?
Strong claim.
Rachmona.
Sorry.
Rachmona is the Mitzvah, Hashem, right? And Shavua is an oath. So, we don't want you to say, Hoidoas people, that it's only in the case of confession. Hu de Ramya Rachmona Shavua Alei. That is the case where the Torah imposes an oath on the person. I don't want you to say that. In other words, I don't want you to believe that the Torah made a special law that only applies to partial confession, that's where you take an oath on the balance. I don't want you to say that. I want you to say that that's an example of a case where there's a partial claim or a partial support for a claim, and now you have to take an oath. Okay, that's where Rabbi Chia is going. Now, why would you think that it's only in a case of confession that we impose an oath on a person? Says Rabbi Chia, I'll tell you why. Ki de Rabba. Like the opinion of Rabbah. In other words, when you know what Rabbah has to say, then you would agree with me that there's a logical argument that only in the case of somebody who made a partial confession should he have to take an oath on the balance. Because you need to understand Rabbah. Rabbah has a whole psychological analysis of what goes through somebody's mind when he owes money and he says, I don't owe it. So what did Rabbah have to say? The Omer Rabbah, because Rabbah taught as follows. Let's see if we can construct this ourselves. Mipnei ma.
Something from the face, what?
Mipnei ma, from the face what? Right, exactly. So what does it mean? Mipnei means because. Mipnei ma, because of what reason? Mipnei ma, because of what reason? Amra Torah. did the Torah say? Because of what reason did the Torah say? Moide miktzes hataino yishava. Moide miktzes hataino is the term that we're right. Is a partial admission to a claim yishava. So why did the Torah say that if a person admits to part of a claim, he should have to take an oath? This is Rabbah explaining the logic behind the Torah. The Torah is the one who told us that if a person admits to part of the claim against them, they have to take an oath on the balance. Rabbah wants to know why. So Rabbah explains why. I'll tell you why. Because chazaka. What's chazaka? We have a legal presumption. Ein adam meiz panav. Ein adam meiz panav. So meiz panav is from the word azus panim, right? No man would have the chutzpah. No man would have the chutzpah. Now this time, by the way, is not mipnei, but rather bifnei, which is a more literal translation. Before, good. Bifnei bal choy voy. In front of his creditor. We're going to say it's direct translation, right? No person's going to have that kind of chutzpah in front of his creditor. Stop before we turn the page. What kind of chutzpah? To deny if he really owed the money. So Rabbi is creating this whole psychological analysis of why this guy is saying, I only owe you part of the claim. So the first step of the analysis is he would never have the chutzpah to say he owes nothing if he really owes money. So now, that's why he's not willing to say, I owe nothing, because he just can't bring himself to do that. Okay, so the obvious question is, so why is he not just owning up? Okay. Turn the page. Let's get the vocab for this next page, even though it's going to break our logical process, but it's fine. We'll come back and we'll review. Boy. Either you know it or you don't. There's no, right? Boy means wants to.
Once.
W, yeah. Wants to. So you can get this in the form of a question sometimes. Boy, Rabbi so-and-so asked the question, but that means he wanted information on this question because it's the shaila, and the shaila is seeking information. So what does he want? In its most literal sense, boy is something he actually wants. Boy. Okay. Now, careful with this one. The root, kof, pei, reish. As soon as you see that, you probably see Yom Kippur in that. And that's one version of this root, which is kapara, atonement. It's not the one we're looking at. There is another word that has the root kof, pei, reish, and that is the word koifer. What's a koifer?
An unbeliever.
A koifer is a heretic. A koifer is a heretic. There's a similar word in Arabic, which is a highly offensive word in this country, because it was used in this country as a pejorative term. But the origin of the term is a person who is a heretic, who doesn't believe in God. And when the Arab slave trade came to Africa, they found people who did not believe in God, so they termed them that word. Okay? So koifer. So what is the word, the root kof pei reish mean? To deny. That's what it means. So a koifer is somebody who denies God, or the validity of the Torah, and in pure halachic financial terms, it's the person who denies that he owes money. Mishum. It's also because. It's also a word for because. Okay, the next one we'll have a little bit of fun with. Shin, mem, tes. What word jumps out at you when you see this root? Okay, shmot has a tof, not a tes. Okay, so shin, mem, tes. Any word that jumps out at you? The word shmita. Shmita comes from that. So what is shmita? Shmita is, besides the obvious that it's the 7th year in the cycle, but shmita is the time that you have to desist from working on the land. So it's basically when you pull back from. That's what this root over here means. To pull back from something. Sovar. Ever heard the expression svara? What's the svara? Now you want to speak Yeshivish, you say, what's the svara? Sovar means he thought, not as in just a random thought, but as in a logical thought. Sovar, he thought through the logical process, or he thought through this particular approach to the issue. Okay. What's ad? Until. Pei reish ayin. Pei reish ayin. That's paroi. Right? Okay. But this is to pay. To pay.
What's the Hebrew word?
Piraon is payment. Lifroa is to pay your debts. Okay, so that's where it comes from. And the last word we need over here is ki, or phrase is ki heichi de, which means in order to. Ki heichi de, in order to. And then we have a phrase, which is an exceptionally useful phrase because it pops up in many places in Gemorah and in common Torah language when people are just talking. Ko mashma lon. Literally, it comes to teach us. Here's what Kamash Malon means. You ready for this? Kamash Malon does this. It says, listen, if you just read this information, you would probably think that the law is X and Y. That's why I had to give you additional information, Kamash Malon, to illustrate that the law is not like you would have thought. So effectively, Kamash Malon always illustrates why you had to tell me something that seemed unnecessary, and what I learned from it that I would not have already known. Okay? So let's use an example. Let's say that a person came to Mincha, and Mincha was at 5:30. So next week, they see that there's a message that goes out that says, this week, Mincha is going to be at 5:30. So I say, I don't get it. Mincha is already at 5:30. Why do you have to put out another message? So the person says, you have to realize it's starting to get dark earlier. You might have thought that we already have to move Mincha to 5:20. Kamash Melon, that we can still daven at 5:30. That's that kind of how you would use this kind of expression. Okay, let's go back. Rabbah told us that a person would never have the chutzpah to look his creditor in the eye and say, I owe you nothing, if he owes him something. That's for sure. So why doesn't he just say, okay, I owe the money, you're right. Why didn't he say that? Let's continue. The high. Does anybody remember what high is? We had it last week. The high, and this guy, because high means this one, right? So the high, and this person, this debtor, this defendant, Bechulei. Okay, we're going to have a lot of word construction over here. Bechulei. What's the root of this word? Kol. What's kol?
Everyone.
Everything. All of it. So bechulei, in all of it, in other words, the entire amount, bo'ei, he wanted denich perei. The root of that word, kuf pei reish, is to deny. He really wanted to deny the whole claim against him. That's what he really wanted. So why didn't he? Why didn't he deny the whole claim? The reason he did not deny the full amount, that was mishum. What's mishum? Because the ein adam meis panav. Because
No man will do that in front of
nobody has the chutzpah to deny in the face of his creditor. So again, what does he really want if you had to catch him on the quiet and ask him, what do you think about this loan? He wants to say, well, this money that you owe, he wants to say, I want to get out of this. I don't want to have to pay a cent. Why doesn't he deny the whole thing? Because he doesn't have the chutzpah to do that face to face with his creditor. So why doesn't he acknowledge the whole amount? The high and the same person. Bechulei, what's bechulei?
In all of it.
The full amount. Bo'ei, what does bo'ei mean?
1 is 2.
He wants to delay. He wants to acknowledge the full amount. Deloidi comes from the word modeh, right? To acknowledge. So really, this guy wants to acknowledge that he owes the full amount. Okay, so why is he not doing that? V'hai delo oidi. So if he really wants to acknowledge that he owes the money, why is he not doing so? V'hai, this person, delo oidi, the fact that he's not acknowledging the full amount, even though he wants to. You know why not? Because ishte mutei. There you've got that root, shin memtes. What does shin memtes mean?
Desist.
He's trying to desist. He's trying to wriggle out. He's trying to get out of this current confrontation. That's all. That's the only reason he's not admitting the full amount. Because he's trying to wriggle his way out of this current confrontation. Why? Sovar. Because he thinks, because he thinks, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to play for time. It's not like I don't plan to pay. I just can't pay right now. So I'm going to play for time. How am I going to pay for time? Until dehavuli zuzi, until I have the money. And then when I have the money, uforan alei.
You'll pay.
Then I'll pay. This is Rabbo's concern. Rabbo says the Torah believes that this guy who's only admitting to part of the claim against him, the reason he's only admitting to part of the claim is because he doesn't have the chutzpah to deny it, but he doesn't have the resources to pay it. So he thinks he's going to pay installments. In his mind, he believes these will be installments. He'll pay 50 zuz now, and let the guy come back with another claim in a few weeks' time. He'll pay another 50 zuz. Or maybe the guy won't even come back with the other claim. Maybe he'll just be glad that he got out of this with 50% of his money recovered. Says Rabbi, the Torah is not happy with that. The Torah needs to test what is he really thinking. Therefore, Therefore, the Torah says, Rami Shavua Alei. Impose an oath on him, because an oath is a very serious business. And a guy who has this kind of conscience, but at the same time is feeling the pressure, is going to be afraid of what an oath implies. And what's that going to do? Why do we want the oath on him? Ki heichi de. It's on this page. In order that, right? Ki heichi de. In order that, lo yidilei b'chulei. He'll own up. Because now he's got the pressure of an oath on him. As long as he lived in his little fantasy that he could just play this game and not have to pay the money, and maybe the guy would feel bad for him and maybe he'd let him off the hook, then he was willing to take the chance of saying, I only owe you 50%. But the minute the judges came down to him and said, right, hold this Torah in your hand, say Hashem's name, take an oath, he was like, whoa, I'm not going that far. I do actually owe the money. So Rabbah says, I can understand why you would think that the oath is only relevant in a case of confession, because this whole mechanism of squeezing the truth out of him only applies in a confession. Avol. But, hadoas edim, if there are witnesses to the fact that he owes part of the claim against him. Now here's an expression we've already had previously. It's a term we've already had before, where you cannot say this. In other words, you can't apply this logic. Think about it. Imposing an oath on him, he wasn't the guy trying to sneak out of this. He was denying outright that he owes the money. And unfortunately for him, there are witnesses. What's it going to help not to take an oath? He was never thinking, I don't want to get out of the loan. A maloi. So I would say there's no room for an oath over here. The oath is not going to achieve anything. The oath is a mechanism to squeeze the truth out of a guy who's not currently willing to tell us the truth.
So what's the meaning of deleka?
Deleka lemei marhochi, where you cannot say so. In other words, you cannot use this same argument or the same logic.
Hey, my law, no need for oath.
my lawyer, so there's no room for an oath, not no need. There's no room for an oath. The oath has no benefit of it. It has no place in this. The purpose of the oath in the confession was leverage. Let's get the full story out of a guy who could be playing games with us. If they're witnesses, who's playing games? The witnesses told you hard facts. Nobody's playing games. What's the value of the oath? So what's Rabbi Chia saying? That's what you would have thought. You would have thought that the Torah only assigned the oath to the case where this particular logical flow applies, where there is a guy who possibly is trying to get out of paying the full amount because he can't afford it, but doesn't want to get out of the loan because he feels bad, and therefore the oath is going to squeeze the truth out of him, and that's not relevant to witnesses. You'd think. Comes along Rabbi Chia and says, Kol mashmelon kal v'chomer. Therefore, Rabbi Chia says, that's exactly why I had to say kal v'chomer, because I need you to understand that even though your logic says the oath only belongs in the case where the person makes a partial admission, actually, because fundamentally confession is less powerful than witnesses, therefore kal v'chomer, whatever law applies to the confession, must apply to the witnesses. So therefore, if there's an oath in the case of the confession, even though the reason for that oath is because of the particular psychology of that particular case, doesn't matter. Once the oath belongs in the case of confession, kal v'chomer, it surely must be that it's relevant in the case of witnesses, because witnesses have more clout. They must be able to obligate a person at least as much as his own confession does. What the Gemorah will do next is say, not so sure your kal v'chomer works, because your kal v'chomer is predicated on an absolute value to confession that is less than the absolute value of witnesses. But it might not be so absolute. Who says that witnesses are always stronger than confessions? Because if they're not, then it's not a kal and a chomer. So the whole next part of the Gemorah is test this theory to see if really confessions are less powerful than witnesses.
Can you quickly run through it?